when we start to get to the leading edges of evolution. In other words, where nature itself is continuing to grow and evolve, and so it's bringing forth new stages of growing up. When the next stage, the rational stage, emerged, it tended to look back on the earlier stages, the mythic and the magic, as being just that. The mythic stage was actually a bunch of myths. Irrationality didn't buy that. And the rational stage started to emerge on a cultural level for the West with what we call the Enlightenment. And so we had not only things like the discovery of most of the modern sciences, modern physics, modern chemistry, modern biology, modern astronomy, modern geology, they all emerged within a couple hundred years of the emergence of the rational stage of development. And that's also when we started to get a moral inclusion that started to become, like rationality, universal in its reach. So you no longer had something like Hindu chemistry versus Protestant chemistry. You just had chemistry. And it applied all over to every human being on the face of the planet. And so because our multiple intelligences do tend to follow usually quite similar degree of development, we also had a moral development that moved to those universal stages of development. That's only about 200 years ago. But that also, notice, is the first time that we actually got rid of slavery, was with the emergence around 200 years ago with this rational stage of moral development and cognitive development and so on.
Right.
So you can start, when you start to look back on historical events through these growing up stages of development, you can see an awful lot of stuff starts to make sense when you look at it through a developmental lens.
Right. So I want to actually, Ken, I want to interrupt for 1 second, okay? Because this is, man, again, so grateful to be here with you. It's so juicy. There's so many different tangents that we can go on. We're getting a really good synopsis of, some of your core work here. And for those of you that are listening, it's the first time, integral theory is a real matrix that tries to put a framework and a system around how we evolve, how our thinking evolves, how these different lines of development evolve. And we're talking about these different levels. And one of the coolest things that I ever got from you, Ken, and to this day, this just impacts me on a daily basis, is that when we look at the history of humanity and we look at the stages of development that they go through, and then you can map it perfectly to our own lives, which you just mentioned. But what a revelation, the fact that our history is mapped to the same stages that we go through as individuals.
Right.
It's humbling to realize that, but also makes so much sense. Well, of course, history maps to us because history is made up of us.
Right. And nature doesn't like to repeat itself. So she keeps making a discovery and then she'll reuse it. I mean, the clearest evidence for that is you just look at, we went from atoms to molecules to cells to multicellular organisms. And every multicellular organism today contains atoms and molecules and cells, and then it's systems that include all those cells in cellular systems.
Transcend and include. We transcend and include the previous information. But there are these epics, right? When we look at the levels and the stages, and we don't have to go through each one because, there are volumes of books that you've written, right, about each one of these stages. And you got up into kind of like modern times and, the Enlightenment, which obviously is still very impactful today in terms of how we're operating. And then you mentioned the 1960s and the emergence of second tier, which is integral, and key with what we're seeing in the world right now. Right. And so kind of my question is, like, what really, if you had to name one or two things that really separates that second tier thinking, like why was he so astonished around what was going on in terms of our own brain development and our own awareness on the planet that was so different than anything that he had seen before?
Yeah, it was. And I'll be able to explain that very easily when I finish explaining first tier stage. So we've gotten up to rational stage of development, which emerged it actually started, this is another thing about these developmental stages, is they themselves sort of, in a certain sense, undergo stages of development, in the sense that if you think about all the various stages and you realize that human beings have to go through each stage, the way we grow through them will vary quite a bit. In other words, when I say humanity reached the rational stage of development, what I mean really historically is when about 10% of humanity actually reached as in themselves having a leading edge of rationality, then that's when we started to see the cultural shift. And that still meant some 90% of society was still at a mythic or a magic or an archaic stage. And that's a hard thing to realize and to put into practice, because it does mean that we, as human beings themselves, grow and develop. They do so at different rates, and different amounts of them will be at a mythic stage still, or at a rational stage, and so on. So you have to sort of get a sense of this being a very fluid series of stages, with people having, in the sense of, if you're going to say, oh, I'm 20% of me is magic, and 30% of me is mythic, and 50% of me is rational, something like that. That's sort of how you have to think about it. And we see this particularly when we start to get to the leading edges of evolution. In other words, where nature itself is continuing to grow and evolve. And so it's bringing forth new stages of growing up. Because as far as we can tell, there are at least theoretically, we can conceive of there being perhaps another anywhere from 6 to a dozen types of structures that would go on top. So the last time we saw a major shift in terms of adding a structure or stage of development was in the 1960s. And what happened there was the addition of a stage of development that's variously called postmodern or pluralistic or even relativistic. And what it was a stage that started to come into being in the United States in the 1960s. And I generally refer to it as the green stage or pluralistic stage or postmodern stage or relativistic stage. And what it did was, because each stage can, depending on its own degree of complexity, can be aware of a previous stage of development. And by the time we get to rationality, every stage that emerges beyond rationality is going to transcend and include rationality. So it's going to have the capacity of self-reflection that rationality tended to introduce for the very first time when it came into existence, along with the world-centric stages of moral development, and therefore got rid of slavery and stuff like that. The type of stage that started to emerge, this most recent newly emergent stage, which we call green, postmodern, relativistic, was a stage that in 1959, about 3% of the population in America was at that postmodern, relativistic, pluralistic stage. By 1972, Jacques Derrida was the most frequently quoted academic in America, and about 15% of the population had moved into a postmodern relativistic stage. Today, it's at around 23 to 25%. That is technically what we would call the leading edge of evolution, although the strictly speaking leading edge would be the number of people that have actually moved to the stage beyond that postmodern pluralistic stage, which would technically be an integral stage, or the beginning of second tier.